On this Thanksgiving, we are joined by Stephen Schwartz, who's the editor of the daily web publication, the Schwartzreport, which concentrates on trends that will shape the future, an area of research that he's been working on since the mid-1960s. Previously, he was a Senior Samueli Fellow in Brain, Mind, and Healing at the Samueli Institute, and he's the author of The 8 Laws of Change, and his latest article at the Journal Explore at explorejournal.com, War, Climate Change and Migration, and Water, Healthcare and Destiny. Welcome to Background Briefing, Stephen Schwartz.
Glad to be here, and happy Thanksgiving to you, Ian.
Well, thank you, Stephen. And, obviously we'd like to focus on what we have to be thankful for on this Thanksgiving. And, of course, there are things to be thankful for. Thanksgiving, of course, is the least commercial holiday in the country, and that's in itself a good thing, and it involves people getting together, families getting together, and a lot of people also go out and feed the homeless. So there are some really lovely aspects to this holiday, but I think in a way what we're going to be talking about on this Thanksgiving Day with you is about some of the things that we not so much have to be thankful for, but that we should be alarmed about, and we'd better damn well do something about it. So how do we bridge that on a day where we don't want to depress people, but on the other hand, we can't be in denial?
Well, I think the way we have to do this is we have to begin making preparations, because we are facing a crisis really unlike anything that has occurred in human history. I mean, if you look at the climate change projections that IPCC and any number of universities have put out, it becomes very clear that in the not very distant future, we're going to be seeing, for instance, terrific migrations. There are already, according to the UN, about 35 million people who are climate change refugees. There are projected to be, by the later years of this century, as many as 760 million. I was in China recently talking with the Minister of Interior, and their concern, for instance, was the collapse of the Himalayan hydrology, because 7 great rivers depend on that, the glaciers and the hydrology of the Himalayas, and it's breaking down, and 1.4 billion people are dependent on that. And so what's going to happen to those people? Or if you look at it from another point of view, 52% of Americans live in what's called a coastal county, the largest population density in the country, and we're going to have, based on projections, I mean, you can go up and do a Google, 3 major migrations away from the coast because of submergence, sea rise, out of the southwest because of lack of water and temperature rising, and out of the central states because of cataclysmic weather events. And we're just not doing anything to prepare for that.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the only thing comparable to it is the preparation that we made after the First World War, when there was a tremendous number of displaced persons. The governments of Europe, particularly Great Britain and with the help of the United States, because the Second War came within, 1918, 1938, 20 years later, there were people who were living who had a direct memory of what that displacement was like. And so they realized that there were going to be more refugees than could be possibly imagined, and began laying the basis for what would become a program for displaced persons at the end of the Second War. And it took them. They started back in the late 30s, and it took them by 45. They were still in the process of planning this. So it's something that it's not so much that we need to be fearful, although I suppose that, but that we need to begin to prepare, and we're just not doing it.
Well, before we start wringing our hands and tearing our hair out, is there anything that can be done to prevent this catastrophe? In other words, my understanding is, in fact, just the other day, Bernie Sanders in the most recent Democratic presidential debate said we've got about 8 years to deal with it before it's too late. What's your prognosis?
What he's doing is quoting the IPCC, and I think he's probably right. I mean, I have two laws about studying climate change. I've been studying climate change since 1991, which is getting on to be a fair number of years. And in all that time, there are two ironclad laws that I have uncovered. The first is, whatever it is that's predicted, it's going to be worse. And the second law is, whatever time frame is referenced, it'll be shorter. You know, when I first started looking at climate change, we were talking about, well, maybe in 500 years, then it was 200 years, then it was 100 years. You know, now we're down to 30 years. So Bernie Sanders is an intelligent man who understands that in order to maintain social stability, we need to begin to prepare for this. And we're just not doing it. I mean, quite the contrary. In the United States, under the Trump administration, we're going backwards because Trump is doing everything in his power to keep carbon energy industries thriving. And whereas in most other countries, they are making a commitment. I mean, much of Europe, for instance, is committed to having no carbon vehicles on their roadway by 2040. Whereas we're doing exactly the opposite. So I do despair about this. This is, I think Thanksgiving is a time when we should not only give thanks for the things that we have received in the good things in the course of the year, but that we take stock and we sit with our families and friends and we make a commitment that we're going to do what we can to try to prepare for what is coming, because as far as I can see, there is nothing that is going to stop us from getting over 2 degrees.
And again, I'm speaking with Stephen Schwartz, who's the editor of the daily web publication, the Schwartzreport, which concentrates on trends that will shape the future, an area of research he's been working on since the mid-1960s. He was previously a Senior Samueli Fellow in Brain, Mind and Healing at the Samueli Institute, and he's the author of The 8 Laws of Change, and his latest articles at the journal Explore at explorejournal.com are War, Climate Change and Migration, and Water, Healthcare and Destiny. So, but what about mitigating? Is there anything that, I mean, what would it take to be just radically change, which is we need? 8 years is hardly time to do very much, and we know how things move so slowly. And now, as you pointed out, we have a reactionary, a dangerous, ignorant, hateful man in the White House who is doing everything he can to reverse whatever faltering steps have been made towards dealing with this reality. He's totally turned the clock back, and if he gets another 4 years, then I think, you know, you got to put a fork in it.
Well, I mean, could we deal with this? Absolutely. Of course we could. Again, the model is the preparation for World War II, where you mobilize and coordinate a conscious strategy for dealing with a crisis. That's what needs to be happening. We ought to be, instead of cutting money out of FEMA, we ought to be planning in accord with the predictions about climate change to prepare for what is going to happen. We're not only in the United States, but throughout the world. As I said, there's going to be this huge migration process. I just don't think people get it. I mean, just to give you, as of February 2018, more than half of the Syrian population were refugees in their own country or in bordering nations, and the numbers are growing.
Well, that's to do with the Civil War, though, isn't it? And I mean, climate change brought about the conditions of a severe drought, did it not? But my understanding is the countries that are going to literally go under are Iraq, Bangladesh, places like Florida. I mean, walk us through that prognosis. Who's going to be a climate refugee because the land they're living on will be swallowed up by the ocean?
Well, all along the coastal areas, countries like Bangladesh, for instance, most of Bangladesh, based, again, on the research, this is all science-based. This is not political partisanship or whatever. Much of Bangladesh is going to disappear. If you look in the United States, from Miami down, Florida is largely going to submerge. If you look at a city like Virginia Beach, the largest city in Virginia, about 30% of that is going underwater. If you look at the projections, the Outer Banks of North Carolina, Washington, D.C. itself, Baltimore, all of these cities all along the coast are going to experience submergence. The New York, Lower Manhattan in New York. The thing is, because we won't acknowledge that it's going on, we're not laying the track that needs to be done. And that would be, for instance, just take the healthcare issue. I gave a talk at a conference, a medical conference, and I said to the physicians who were in the audience, would you be prepared to have 1,000% increase in the emergency room visits at your hospitals? They said, well, of course not. And I said, but that's what you're facing. So are we putting in the generators? Are we getting the medicines put together? Are we putting up, could we put up the bunks to put people? Or what are we going to do with families? How are we going to deal with sanitation? What are you going to do if a couple 100,000 people pour into an area? Where are they going to go to the bathroom? That kind of stuff. It's all very nitty-gritty. So the answer to how do you prepare is you begin to think about realistically, what is it you're facing? And how can you mitigate the impact as much as possible and accommodate it for where you can't mitigate it? And it takes government at every level. It takes a national commitment, and we just don't see it.
And in terms of reversing global warming, which I would think should be the first priority, if there are things that can be done, that should be done, that must be done, what are they?
Well, I think unlike what has just happened where GM and Toyota have aligned themselves with Trump, I think that the automobile industry, and this is happening, by the way, there are good things happening. The banks have begun to no longer fund exploration for fossil fuels. A number of the larger banks are making a commitment. They're not going to be involved anymore. Many of the car companies are moving into electric vehicles as fast as they can. We need to do everything we can to keep the temperature from rising, above 1.5 degrees centigrade. But I believe based on everything I have studied, I don't think we're going to be able to keep it below 2 degrees. And that's going to mean massive climate change. The southern states are going to become like the middle states. The southern states are going to become tropical. The middle states are going to become like the southern states are now. And the northern states are going to become like the central states or the mid-range states. We need to begin to prepare for these migration issues. We need to prepare for the health care. That's the thing